Welcome everybody to this month's STEMS webinar. So today our speaker will be Wouter Verkerke, who is a professor of physics at the University of Amsterdam. In addition, he is the head of the Atlas group at Nikhef. So Nikhef is the Dutch Institute for Particle Physics, and he's leading the Atlas group there. His research interest in physics revolve around Higgs boson physics and top quark physics, especially at the LHC. And at the LHC, he has a long-time member of the Atlas experiment at CERN, where he has been leading, for example, the top quark physics group and the Higgs combination group. And in addition to those interests, he also is interested in statistics for particle physics applications. So he has been, for example, coordinating the statistics forum in Atlas. And he has also contributed to statistical modeling of particle physics data. So he's, for example, the author of the ROOFIT software, which is part of the Root, which is one of the main software packages that's used to analyze particle physics data. So if you have worked with Root, you might be familiar with his work on ROOFIT. So today he will be talking to us about some of those kind of insights that he has gained from working with kind of studies for particle physics. The title of his talk is Answering Modeling in Particle Physics. So with that, Wouter, you can go ahead and share your screen and get started whenever you're ready.
Yes, 1 second. Let me find the window again. Okay. 1 second. Okay.
Right.
And then full screen.
Yeah, perfect. Looks good.
So everything's good?
Yeah, looks good. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Then I get started. So, thank you all for inviting me. So what I want to talk to you about today is uncertainty modeling in particle physics, and this is sort of partly meant as a pedagogical talk, and of course, as formulated like this, it's an insanely broad topic. What I will focus on mostly on this presentation is how we do things at the LHC and a bit more general in collider physics, but this really covers quite substantial part of particle physics. Now, as an introduction to the subject, in general, what we're trying to do in particle physics is that we have a very nice theory, the Standard Model, which in its simplest form fits as an equation on a mug, and we try to determine if nature follows those rules. So to be able to prove that, we've built many and very elaborate experiments over the past decades, like the Large Hadron Collider now, and we study the physics that is predicted by the Standard Model in these events. So what is somehow easy for us is to simulate the predictions of the Standard Model and try to see if we can make simulated events. The hard part for us is trying to learn something from the observed data, where we want to go back and do the inference step and see if we can conclude the Standard Model is correct or its parameters are measured correctly. So this is very much a data science game, and there's also lots of opportunities for AI and machine learning here, and this is also increasing exponentially, even though I think the first efforts were already more than 2 decades ago. But one of the things that's particularly of importance here is that when you train these models on simulation, it's that you have to be able to trust the simulation, and this is more or less the topic of my presentation. So if you see it in slightly more mathematical terms, what our theory has is a bunch of unknowns parameters mu, and what we do with that is that we create these collisions, and to be able to describe these collisions, which can produce hundreds of particles with lots of kinematic information, you really have a probability model for the physics that is produced at the LHC that is super high dimensional, where X can be hundreds of thousands of dimensions. So we are not capable of analytically formulating this probability model. So what we can do with lots of software is to simulate this, and we end up with simulated samples of X. And from that, we have to infer what the distribution is. And in fact, it's even worse than that, because the aggregate data set is so large that this is terabytes, if not petabytes of events. So there is additional data reduction that happens, and then from this reduced data that I call the data set Y over here, we try to make a step backwards where we formulate a likelihood function that can then tell us something about those parameters mu. Now, what I want to do in this presentation is 5 steps. Talk first a little bit about the sources of uncertainty in the particle physics simulation chain. Then I'll tell you how in a typical analysis strategies we try to minimize the dependence of these uncertainties. I have a very brief intermezzo on how we treat uncertainties in the statistical inference in general. And then I want in the second part to show you what kind of issues we run into when we try to describe these uncertainties in our models and where we actually run into some real issues as part of the simulation process. So a good first question to ask yourself is, why are these predictions actually uncertain? The standard model, we're looking for imperfections in it. Dark matter is not in it, gravity is not in it, there might be a few other things, but for most of the mundane things, it's a pretty good theory that has been highly predictive, and for almost 5 decades we've not been able to find much flaws with it. The reason that we have difficulties with this is that our ability to calculate tangible predictions from this model depend very much on the energy regime where we are. Generally speaking, every process is an infinite sum of amplitude contributions that we write down in these Feynman diagrams, and in practice we can make calculations with a truncation of this power series of diagrams, because the perturbation parameter like alpha electroweak is a very small number, and that means we can afford to calculate only a subset. But this is strictly only true when alpha is small, and for example for the strong interaction, this parameter depends on the energy scale, and if the energy scale is of the order of 1 GeV, this strong parameter is not very small, it's rather 0.5, and that means that if you try to calculate the importance of all of the higher order diagrams, next to leading order, next to leading order, this series doesn't converge, and then even though the theory is correct, we can't actually get any numerical predictions out of it. So this means that if we try to map out the whole process of simulating physics at the LHC, we have to break down the various steps of the process into different energy regimes, and we'll have to follow different procedures at each of those energy regimes. So here I present you with a highly simplified picture of what that more or less looks like in 4 steps. So the first part of these descriptions of these processes is we need to understand what's happening inside the proton, given the fact that we calculate these protons. So this is actually firmly in the regime that's not calculable. This is a part where we really have to rely on measurements of the proton structure. Then follows the hard interaction, where 2 constituents of the proton have a super high energy collision of hundreds of GeVs, of 1 TeV. This is where all of the interesting physics for us is. This is very well calculable because this is at very high energy scales. But then we gradually move down again in energy scale, so there is sort of a transition regime called parton showers, where we have sort of a hybrid calculation regime between exact calculations and empirical modeling, where various assumptions go in, and at the end of the process, when all of the particles that reach the detector are made, we're again firmly in the low energy regime, and also there we can't actually calculate much. So what we do is that we have different procedures for each of those steps. As I mentioned before, for example, for the proton structure, we largely base these on large-scale fits to experimental data, and this is a whole process on its own with groups that make these fits, and they actually have very good handling of their uncertainties. Then what we usually involve in ourselves is the estimation of the particular process of interest that we're trying to calculate. And the essence of what makes these predictions difficult is that we truncate this power series of Feynman diagrams somewhere, so we know that we leave out some part of the calculation, and we don't know exactly what that part of the calculation looks like, other than a hand-waving assumption that it's not a too big part of it. This transition regime of the parton showers is actually also a difficult part. So here, what we typically try to do is to estimate the uncertainty on this part is that we try to move the boundaries a little bit between the calculation regimes. So anything on the left is nicely calculable. Anything on the right, we only use empirical models, and by changing the boundaries where we change from one strategy to the other, we get a feeling for how accurate this part is. And the last part, this is actually based on mostly on empirical models that have been trained over the past 30 years on lots of experimental data. They can actually describe the low energy part of these collisions very well, but it's not really fundamental physics modeling that happens here. It's mostly packages with large numbers of tunable parameters. And to make things slightly worse, there is multiple implementations of those packages, and they occasionally disagree on the prediction, and that's also something that we have to deal with. Now, the last part, where we build these enormous detectors and then reconstruct data, is also part of the chain. And this actually works really, really well. If you think about these large-scale detectors, which have millions of parts, we have very good simulation processes for these that can process and can describe the low-energy physics in detectors quite well. And even though these are difficulties and uncertainties nowadays with the precision measurements at the LHC, quite often they're not the dominating uncertainties. And given the fact that we can also often measure these uncertainties from control measurements, these are not the most difficult situations that we have to deal with. Now, a good question to ask yourself is the generation of these collisions in general accurate? So all of the packages that go into these chains of simulations, this is work of decades, and in many cases we have amazing precision in being able to describe precisely how all the processes are modeled at the various energy regimes. At the same time, it's also really quite uneven sometimes. There are certain areas which are famously difficult and we have to navigate around them. For example, QCD multijet production, which is by far the dominant process at the LHC. This one's almost impossible to simulate. It's a huge background for everyone. We usually try to get rid of it by trying to make selections that exclude most of it, but we cannot get accurate calculations for these. So this is something that we still have to work around. Usually accurate calculations involve processes which have high energy scales and make the calculations easier that way, but even there sometimes there are areas where you have to navigate carefully. For example, the production of the top quark pairs, which is very much a high energy process, has details that have proven to be very difficult to model. For example, the kinematic distributions of those pairs is something that is only converging slowly now with really large-scale variations between theory calculations up to orders of 20, 30, 40%. In general, any process that has multiple energy scales is difficult, and we still see in many of the processes of interest that you can be 30, 40% off. Now, we of course make progress on this, and we try to validate all of these things and improve the Monte Carlo generation chain with new things we learn. But one of the things to keep in mind here is that most of the studies that we do and most of the validation plots that we make are the plots like the one shown over here. These are one-dimensional differential distributions for a lot of distributions, but typically we don't explicitly investigate 2 or 3D distributions and in particular their correlations. So you have to be a little bit careful in assuming that those are also accurately modeled. And this is, I think, of particular importance when you start to work a little bit more with AI models that can exploit all of this information, and sometimes even without you knowing it. Now, having sketched the main uncertainties, I wanted to show you a little bit about how we typically deal with those uncertainties in our analysis steps and how we try to minimize their effect. So broadly speaking, a HAP data analysis is 2 steps always. There is first a data reduction step where we go from samples of billions of events and petabytes of data to something that is manageable for a particular analysis project. And AI and ML is actually quite popular here to find ways in which you can discriminate signal from background events. Modeling of systematic uncertainties is usually not an enormously complicated task here because you only need to get this approximately right, and if you are not exactly spot on, your selection could be suboptimal, but any biases you can correct for in the inference step. And then in the inference step, which is the second part on these reduced data sets, there it is quite important that we can really try to capture all of the details of the simulations, and in particular that we try to model all of the uncertainties and correct for any discrepancies between data and simulation. So here, a lot of the work that I will discuss actually goes in. So if you take a typical LHC data analysis, here I take the LHC, the Atlas measurement, the recent one of Higgs production DK to W's. We measure lots of distributions, and as you see from these plots is that the signal is usually not super large. That's the small red sliver you see over here on top of a large number of backgrounds. And usually we don't want to trust the simulation to get all of these proportions and all of these rates right. So what we do is we design measurements which have lots of control regions where the individual backgrounds dominate, for example, the yellow TT bar background or the green Z gamma background. And then we try to use these control regions to measure whether the simulation is correct, and if it's not correct, to make adjustments on the fly here. So this is something that we do on quite large scale. So here is a picture that's slightly more realistic. So you see that we try to divide up our distributions in many signal regions, and each of those have their own control regions. And there is a very large number of parameters that tries to correlate the rates between these models. And I can fill the whole plot with arrows here, but I think you get the idea. So if we zoom in to what we actually then do, and where the difficulties are, is this is a plot with a yield distribution, and we usually model that with a simple bin likelihood where we have a prediction for every bin, and this prediction comes into a signal part, which is an integral part that I call SK over here, and then a distribution part, and then there is a background. And then what we ultimately want to do is we want to relate this back to the physics of interest, and that's usually processes that integrate over the whole phase space. So these are these cross sections sigma k, but we don't measure the whole phase space. We only measure a small fraction of it, the part that we've chosen to select in our analysis procedures. And this part that is then selected, we call the acceptance times efficiency, and these factors epsilon, they can be quite sensitive to modeling uncertainties in the simulation. So in fact, this epsilon is very sensitive, also these distributions, and of course the backgrounds. So one way in which we can reduce these uncertainties is to follow slightly different analysis designs. Usually what you start off with is that you want to directly measure, say, the total cross-section of a process, because this is what you're interested in. Then you realize you only measure 1% of the phase space in your measurement, but then you put that correction factor into your measurement, and then your measurement immediately reports the total cross-section. But in doing so, you have a very large extrapolation factor, and if there is modeling uncertainties on what the distribution looks like inside the big red box, this ratio of the green to the red one can have sizable uncertainties. So you can reduce this by effectively giving up on the idea of immediately measuring the inclusive cross-section, but rather measure a production rate in a restricted area of phase space, which is a little bit larger than your measurement region, but not a lot. Then the extrapolation, this acceptance rate is much closer to 1. The uncertainties on that will be a lot reduced. But of course, you give up on the immediate interpretability of this, but this is then an issue that you can solve later, but at least your measurement will not be intricately tied with large systematic uncertainties. On the other side of this equation, where we have predictions of physics processes of interest, we also apply other strategies with ratio corrections, for example. A common form that we see in our measurements is that the cross-section of a particular process has a predicted standard model part, and then there are additions, which are the new physics that we look for. But these additions are calculated with less precision than the standard model part. And then rather than simply adding those parts and mixing parts with low and high precision, we can argue, for example, that if you would look at a ratio of this sigma BSM to the standard model in the same order, that some of the uncertainties in that cancel, and then you can multiply these ratios with the highest level precision prediction you have for the standard model, and you end up with an overall more precise prediction. So we implement strategies like these to control these. In the next part, I want to talk a little bit more about how we then model these uncertainties in our probability models. Before I go there, I had a very brief intermezzo on what we actually mean with uncertainties. So, as most of you will undoubtedly know, is that particle physics is still very much predominantly a frequentist field. So that means that we care a lot about coverage. and how we design our procedures. The main point I wanted to highlight in this intermezzo is that it also influences a lot of the practicalities on how we model systematic uncertainties, because the way we do things with profile likelihood ratios makes certain approaches computationally rather cheap, and that means that we can do a lot of details in the models. So just to remind you, as a frequentist, you construct a confidence belt that maps the relation between the observable and the parameter you try to measure. Then there is a measurement, and from the intersection you calculate the confidence belt. The left is the literal textbook picture. On the right is what we actually do when we don't have a single observable X, but rather insert a likelihood ratio test statistics that summarizes our more complicated measurements. And conceptually, everything stays the same in the sense that the intersection of the measurement line, which is now curved with the confidence belt, still gives you the confidence interval. And you can also extract as a bonus the significance of various hypotheses from this. What we do in practice is that we have quite a bit of statistics, so we usually feel safe enough to be in a regime where we assume that Wilks theorems hold. In that case, the confidence belt is exactly rectangular, and it becomes easy to calculate these intervals. Now, in the context of what we're talking about here is that when we want to introduce the modeling of systematic uncertainties, we do this always through the introduction of nuisance parameters. And these nuisance parameters, you have to find some parametric form, and this is what I will talk more about. You can assign them an uncertainty, and if you then modify your likelihood ratio to a profile likelihood ratio, you see that your likelihood ratio curve as function of mu always broadens and results into wider intervals. So there's a couple of finer points here that I will not elaborate on further in the presentation, but it's good to know. The first one is that this distribution of the test statistic can in principle depend on the values of theta. In the LHC, we largely ignore that, and we have chosen the practical approach that we always use the best fit value of theta as the value where we sample the distribution. The second point, which is important for the rest of the presentation, is that by implementing analysis this way, the computation of T mu is actually relatively cheap, even if theta has a dimension or 100 or 1000. Because unlike a Bayesian approach where you would have to integrate over a large number of dimensions, here we only have to minimize things, and that's computationally cheap, and you will see that in practice. LHC analysis will have hundreds or even thousands of nuisance parameters, and those fits can still run in a matter of hours. Now, sort of the hard/interesting part for physicists is then trying to decide how we are going to build a model that describes our data and how to incorporate the known uncertainties in the predictions, and also largely how to mitigate for those known uncertainties. So here, just to sketch the various routes that are taken, I sketch you 3 scenarios. So suppose that you have some kind of distribution that I show you on the right over here, and you don't want to rely on knowing the details. The simplest strategy one can follow is to define a signal region and a control region and simply count the events in both regions. This has the advantage that you know what the distribution is. It's always going to be a Poisson in either one. And the issue you have in the signal region is that you know that there is a little bit of background in there. In this case, we've chosen to measure that from the control region, which is slightly larger, and then you have this scale factor tau, which corrects for that. So this is what we usually call the data-driven approach, and to first order that is also correct, but of course there's a little bit of dirty laundry in this, in the sense that in this extrapolation factor tau, you still make some assumptions on the simulation that predicts that in this case the background is perfectly flat. The other approach that you can take, for example, for processes where you don't have good control regions, is that you take the same information from simulation. And what we usually do over there is that we simply express this also as a measurement. So we write down a probability model that sort of quote-unquote measures the background B from sort of a theory observation of a certain simulation value along with a certain simulated error. And that has the advantage then that you can use exactly the same formalism to swap out data-driven measurements and information you inject from theory calculations. In practice, and this is what I call the realistic approach here, you see that we don't, in fact, are aware of the fact that if you follow the data-driven approach, which we generally prefer, that there is we have to take into account that the simulation uncertainty will predict some uncertainty or tau, and we take that into account then as a third term, as I show here on the bottom. Now, another thing that I wanted to mention is that to write things down in a slightly more simplified form, what we usually do is that when we have a theory predictions or generally any kind of term that tries to control an uncertainty, is that we try to simplify these terms into unit Gaussians. So that means that we simply make a coordinate transformation where all of the physics information is transferred from the right to the left. So what I do here is that I simply make a coordinate transformation from a nuisance parameter B for the background to a new nuisance parameter alpha. And alpha is constrained by a unit Gaussian here. And then I have what I call a response function B of alpha. And if I choose this function appropriately, it presents the same information as my equation above. The advantage of choosing this form is that everything that we need to know is then in one place. And this B of alpha is actually also the hard part to calculate, because in principle, if you want to know how the background changes as function of some underlying uncertain concept in the simulation, we would have to run the simulation again and again for every value of alpha and sample what the value of B would be. And this is also precisely the approach that we take. So typically we would sample B of alpha only at 3 points, at 0 and at plus and minus 1. And then we apply some kind of simple interpolation procedure to make it into a function. And if these changes are relatively smooth, this works well. The nice thing about this approach is that it also scales up rather efficiently to situations where you have multiple uncertainty sources affecting your background, and then you can simply sample the background as function of multiple parameters alpha. Here I have a nice two-dimensional plot, but in practice you'll see that sometimes there is 3 or 4 or 5 of these nuisance parameters that are sampled in this way. So this is for counting experiments. Then for distributions, in fact, you can do exactly the same thing, because a distribution is of course nothing different than a series of consecutive counting experiments. So if you treat every bin of a histogram as a counting experiment, you can follow this interpolation approach for every bin, and then you can construct a beautiful function which slowly transforms the shape of a distribution, for example here a shifting Gaussian, in a way that is often good enough for the precision at which we know systematic uncertainties. So that leaves us then, in principle, with a nice framework to implement most of the systematic effects that we know about. But it also leaves quite a few things, difficult decisions where we're not precisely sure what to do with things. And these are often the thorny, loose ends of any large-scale data analysis project. So going back to this WW analysis that I showed you earlier, so here you see an analysis which tries to measure the blue distribution. There's various backgrounds. These backgrounds are then constrained from control regions, and by choosing a common parameter for the yellow background / signal in both plots, we can constrain simulation uncertainties by injecting some information from data. So these are often the easy scenarios. The harder part is when there is less clear information. For example, this particular signal that we're looking at, it can also be produced with an additional jet. Then all of the ratios of signal to background look rather different. There is also a separate control region again for that background, but the degree to which sort of the background, the yellow background on the left and the yellow background on the right have a correlated or uncorrelated uncertainty, these things are often not precisely known from the calculations, and here we'll have to make some choices, and some result in smaller uncertainties than other, and this is precisely where the discussions become difficult. So this approach in most analysis is woven into a very dense network of signal and control regions, and we will end up with typical measurements of 20, 30, 50, up to hundreds of signal and control regions that together try to constrain most known sources of uncertainty. And The thorny discussions at the end are always then around the discussions on whether you need to have one nuisance parameter to describe multiple regions or uncorrelated separate nuisance parameters to describe them. And often from the underlying uncertainty concepts in the calculations, we don't always have perfect guidance on this. So before I say a little bit more about the physics, I just wanted to say a few things about how these things play out. So the most common problem we have is that we say we have, in a very simplified scenario, two signal regions that both measure some signal and some background, and then we have a background where we don't have clear guidance from the theory calculations on whether the uncertainty in region 1 and region 2 should be correlated. So that leaves us then with multiple approaches in which it could be done. I mean, you could of course take them as correlated, and if your POI is in the sum of the signals, you know that this is the more conservative approach. It will give you the largest uncertainty. You could also argue that maybe the sources are uncorrelated, and then there's still a 10% uncertainty in each, but the effect on the sum of the signals will be smaller. And if you're very daring, you could perhaps argue that they're anti-correlated, and then the effect on the sum of the signal is almost zero. So here we usually try to find something that we then call appropriately conservative, which is a bit of a hand-waving say of we want to choose a model which errs a little bit on the side of caution. The important part to take away from this is also that what is the cautious approach depends very much on how you're going to interpret this, right? So if you are going to interpret the sum of the signals as your POI, then correlated nuisance parameters is conservative. If you have a different interpretation where the ratio is your POI, then it's exactly the other way around. But even then, there is other things that we have to watch out for. So the previous example was two measurements of comparable statistics, but this is often not the case. Quite often we have regions with very high statistics, regions with much lower statistics, and then other dynamics can take over. So one thing that can happen, and in fact does happen quite often, is that we have one very high statistics region with a very small uncertainty on the data, and what the effect is on the analysis is that the background uncertainty that we implement our model is simply as a much larger variation than the statistical uncertainty of the data. And what ends up happening is that the uncertainty on that nuisance parameter gets trimmed to make those consistent again. And in this toy example, for example, the uncertainty gets reduced from 10% to 5%. You can have a whole separate discussion on whether this is something you want or not, but in the discussion of correlations, if you have a correlated model where you have one parameter that describes both regions, the effect now is that you've also reduced the uncertainty in the other low statistics region through the assumption of correlation, and it's actually unclear if that's the right thing to do, because now you've reduced the uncertainty on both. So in those kind of scenarios, you want maybe separate nuisance parameters so that you can retain your larger uncertainty in the low statistics region. So here, I mean, if you know from the source of the uncertainty, if you can assume these regions to be correlated, you can make choices that are motivated by the underlying physics. But if there is no underlying clear physics motivation, this is something that needs a great deal of attention, and diagnostics are also quite important. The first step of recognizing and mitigating these problems is to be aware of the fact that they happen in the first place. Okay, finishing off on this subject. One of the sometimes too simple conclusions from running into these issues is that maybe it's just best to then decorrelate the modeling of the uncertainties in all of the various regions, because then these constraining effects are much less of a problem. But also here you have to again be careful, because if I just take any signal region and just arbitrarily split it into 10 regions, and I each assign them the same uncertainty, then the effect on the sum of the 10 regions is reduced by a factor of square root 10. And if there was no good physics motivation for assuming that these regions were uncorrelated, I have spuriously reduced my signal. So I just wanted to sketch to you here that there is, if you want to deal with the parts of your theory predictions where the structure of the correlations is unclearly predicted, it's quite a difficult way to navigate into what is the correct model to describe in your data analysis. Okay, so having said all of those things, I wanted to then on the last part focus a little bit on how we run into these issues in practice in various parts of our physics simulation for LHC events. So the goal at the end, and that's why we do all of those elaborate procedures, is of course that we want to find a parametric model which has enough nuisance parameter that it can cover the true distribution, and then that it can cover that. But given the fact that we don't know what the true distribution is, it's not a very practical goal. So what we do instead is that we inventorize all known sources of systematic uncertainties, which can be hundreds, if not thousands of terms. We formulate parametric forms to model each of these, and then we assume that this is an exhaustive approach. And as I mentioned to you, we have different sources of information, and they also really affect on how many thorny problems you're going to have in the modeling of these. So the easiest class of systematics is if the uncertain part of your prediction comes from something that is effectively another measurement, say a calibration measurement of some type, that is where the data is simply not part of your physics measurement, but it's still a measurement, and then you have even a likelihood function if you wish, and you understand the correlation structure from the measurement that you did, and you can simply include all of those things. So this is what we typically call the good uncertainties, and there's many of those, and it's just work to calculate them. The part where we get into much more headache problems is uncertainties that are based on shortcoming of theory calculations, where there is no relation to data. So quite often there is no meaningful parametric prescription of the form of the uncertainty. Even worse, quite often the source of these uncertainties doesn't even come with a probabilistic interpretation, where you can say if you follow this prescription it's 68% confidence level, or it's a variance or something. So these are what we call the ugly systematics, and this is why quite often we have lengthy discussions on how to best model these. So in practice, these ugly systematics, they come in two types of prescriptions. The one that I call envelope prescriptions, where an envelope is given along with the instruction that there is no specific parametric form that you can assume for the variations inside this envelope. And then the other one is what I call the two-point form, where we have two equivalent realizations of a simulation. They're both a priori equally good, but they give different predictions, and the only notion that we have of the of a systematic uncertainty is the fact that they're different. So where do we run into these things when we look at our whole chain of processes? So proton structure functions, I started off by saying that these are not calculable. The distribution on X is simply something that we have to measure from data. How this evolves with the scale q squared is actually predicted by theory, but altogether this is effectively just a giant measurement, and even though it's not calculable, as an experimentalist, this is not a very difficult a source of very difficult problems. Because these are effectively fits to data, and therefore external measurements that have been made for decades now, there are very detailed parameterizations of these structure functions. They come with nicely organized systematic uncertainties. Usually you have like over 40 parameters in Hessian forms that are all nicely orthogonal, that you can then all vary and propagate. So we usually treat this as a good systematic. The bonus is that we usually have at least two variants, and we also trust these parameterizations to the level that if we measure new data, say from Atlas at new kinematic regimes, that we also trust these models to reduce the uncertainties on these proton density functions. And because you have two, you even have some ways to validate that. The really hard part often in the uncertainties come for us in the calculation of the hard scatter. So this is the part where I said in principle these are the easiest to calculate because they're at high energy, but the form of the uncertainty is actually particularly difficult, because what we need to quantify is that we have somehow truncated this series of amplitudes that contribute to the process, and what is missing is the the amplitudes that we couldn't calculate. And since we can't calculate them, we don't really know what their shape or their distribution is. So then we need a procedure to estimate more or less what the effect of that is. And the best known procedure from the theoretical side is that we vary some of the unphysical scales in the calculation in a number of ways. So this is a prescription which is somewhat empirical in nature, but has also a physics motivation, but it really should be seen as something that gives you an approximate uncertainty. And these procedures, they give us, for example, these envelope prescriptions where the statement that is made is that the prediction will be somewhere inside this envelope, but don't make any assumptions on the structure inside. And to demonstrate to you that this is really a problem of this shape, I show you, for example, a calculation of an inclusive Z production sample as function of the transverse momentum of the Z. And this picture is nice because it not only shows you the data, but it also shows you for 3 successive generations of calculations at increasing level of precision on how these things change. So what we're effectively trying to capture with a systematic uncertainty is the part that's not on the plot. So you have leading order, and then next to leading order, and next to leading order, and the systematic uncertainty should cover from n3 LO to infinity LO. But what this plot very nicely shows you is that, for example, between leading order and next to leading order, you see that the effect, the prediction of the calculation is quite non-uniform. In fact, this ratio plot on the left bottom shows you that for low PT, there is a 40% effect, and for high PT there is actually a 0% effect. So you see that the ratios of things at low and high PT can dramatically change as you include higher order. So it is indeed unsafe to assume that only the total rate is uncertain and the shape is invariant, and that's why you have to be careful. So that means that if you have any kind of measurement where, say, your control region is at low PT and your signal region is at high PT, or in general anywhere where your transport factor has a large factor from a theory uncertainty that is dominated by these missing higher orders, that you have to be careful in constructing what is the transport factor uncertainty between those regions. There are special cases here that are difficult, and I will not cover in the interest of time. The other part where we often have thorny problems is then in the part where we actually can't calculate things, so these Parton showers and randomization and fragmentation, where I mentioned that we have multiple packages that do a reasonably good job at predicting many processes, but for most processes they do give significantly different results, and given the fact that they don't make yet any well-defined internal predictions of their uncertainty, we have to consider this difference as an empirical metric of the systematic uncertainty. To convince you that this is a real issue, I just show you 2 plots here. The first one is the tuning of one of those simulation packages when we started taking first data, where you see quite dramatic difference before and after tuning, so data can be quite a bit off. The other example I'll show you is that the difference between the various packages can be statistically very, very significant, so we have to take these things into account. And then the main question is how we should do these things. Now, if we go back to the start of my story when we were just thinking about counting experiments, that is often a good starting point for those discussions because then everything is relatively simple. And if we have a counting experiment, the background is just a number. So it's very easy to write down a response function B of alpha that can take on the value of any possible simulation prediction because it's just a number. So you can write a function B of alpha that for alpha equals 0 corresponds to one generator, and then for, say, alpha equals 1 corresponds to the prediction of another generator. And that gives you then a way in which you can propagate this uncertainty. But you should realize that you've just shifted the hard part of the question a little bit, because then this is not a likelihood where it's at all obvious that, say, a Gaussian constraint, a unit constraint on alpha is anywhere close to representing what we actually don't know, because that would assume, say, that Pythia is preferred over Hurwig with 1 sigma, whereas maybe we want to assume both of them to be equal a priori. So you are stuck with hard questions here. And then if we consider, of course, distributions, which is the basis of most of our measurements, this whole issue becomes exponentially more thorny. you can follow the same approach that we did before, and you say a distribution is just a series of consecutive counting measurements, and then if you apply the approach from the previous page to every counting measurement, you can actually technically construct a function which morphs the distribution of one generator slowly into the other as function of one empirical nuisance parameter. But now, conceptually it's much worse, because yes, you can still measure what the effect is from changing from Hurwitz to Pythia, but of course there is many more ways in which such a distribution could take shape. I mean, the true distribution of Nader, or even that from a third or a fourth Monte Carlo generator, doesn't need to lie on this technically constructed transformation from one function to another. So usually, we say, look, this is the information we have. We assume then that by measuring the distance between two generators, we cover sort of the whole systematic uncertainty under the assumption that all of these differences are more or less compatible. But what we see quite often happens is that these overall modeling packages, they introduce differences in many of the signal and control regions. So if you insert those kind of models into a fit, it often turns out that you can very, very strongly constrain these nuisance parameters, describe which Monte Carlo generator package is preferred by the data, say either Hurwitz or Pythia or a particular other one. And these very strong statements, they're not very robust, because they really follow from a very technical and physical assumption that there is only one particular way in which you can change from one shape into the other, whereas nature might really look very different. So this is typically a hard problem, and the only way in which you could really make progress in this is if Monte Carlo generators would have a much better intrinsic sense of generated uncertainties, and there is work going on this, but it's a slow process.
Wouter, we have about 5 or so minutes left.
Yes, I'll be on time.
Perfect.
So for experimental systematic uncertainties, as I mentioned, those are often based on measurements. So here we usually don't worry too much. We understand the model, we understand often the correlations. There are some ugly corners in these. In the interest of time, I will not go through these. Some of these ugly corners come from the fact that we often intentionally limit the accuracy of our modeling. For example, if you look at jet calibration systematics, the detailed model will have 200 nuisance parameters, but if you tell that to someone that does a counting experiment with just one bin, they get rather annoyed with having to implement 200 parameters. So we often make simplified models. But then if you would continue to use those simplified models on a more elaborate measurements, you'll make mistakes. So the last point I wanted to touch on is that validation and diagnostics is super important in this field, given the fact that there is many possible problems in modeling that I hope I have convinced you can happen when you fit to such complex data sets. Our standard tool for this are what's called the nuisance parameter ranking plots. So if you've never seen them, there is a lot of information in one plot which are all super useful diagnostics. So what you see here are the names of various sources of systematic uncertainties, and they usually correspond to a single nuisance parameter. And the things you see in blue is the impact of changing that parameter by one unit uncertainty onto the parameter of interest, and they're ranked from large to small. So the top ones are a priori the ones that you worry the most about, and the one on the bottom are the ones that you worry the least about. And then overlaid on that, you see how the corresponding nuisance parameter fare in the fit to the data. So given the fact that our standard strategy is to reduce all of these models to unit Gaussians, what's the easiest to come out is that they also fit to unit Gaussian. So that means that the nuisance parameter has a fitted value of 0 and a unit uncertainty. So that tells you that you're simply propagating this uncertainty and there is no bias and no constraint. In this particular example, you see, for example, that there are a few parameters that dance around a little bit, but by order half a sigma, but the errors are largely unit errors, so there's nothing to really worry about. This, in contrast, for example, with another measurement that I show you here, is where the leading systematic uncertainty, Parton-Shouwen generator, so this is the one that I told you about before, where you're trying to put in an artificial parameter that changes from one Parton-Shouwen generator to the other, where the data with this particular model is very strongly inconsistent with one of them and very strongly consistent with the other, the nuisance parameter gets highly constrained, and instead of propagating the a priori assigned 70% uncertainty, we now propagate a 20% uncertainty. So this is not necessarily wrong, but this really means that you're very strongly relying on particular systematics modeling assumptions in your model to get to such a small uncertainty. And for this particular result, in fact, there was a discussion of almost a year to conclude whether this was justified or not. So then I summarize. So simulation is an incredibly powerful tool in particle physics that drives everything from analysis design to inference to AI. It's super useful, but it is also good to be aware of the fact there are still many corners of the phase space where modeling can be quite imperfect. In our analysis strategies, we have a lot of strategies to work around these with ratios and control regions that work relatively well. But in the final inference step, detailed modeling of all of these effects is quite important. And here often we run into limits of our knowledge, where sometimes theory uncertainties don't definitely predict information that we need to quantify to be able to measure something. So for that reason, validations of the results and of the structure of the statistical models is very important, and quite often it's also quite important to think ahead to make sure that your analysis doesn't get stuck at the end of the day by being dominated by uncertainties that we don't fully understand. And I wanted to leave it at this. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Wouter.